do a dance?
Go that way.
Just gonna, before you guys start moving.
Welcome everyone to Feminist Leadership Transforming Boundaries. My name is Kathleen Yabut, and I'm a junior in the class Women's Rights and Policymaking in the United Nations. Well, you should have received with you when you walked in a little packet. So right now, we'd really like to know what feminist leadership means to you. And you can express that either using a drawing, word, or poem on one of the sheets that were given to you. So you can take a few moments to do that using the pens that you were given as well. That's one of the post-its that you were given. You can just write that on there and we'll be sharing them shortly. Yes, on the one post-it. And after doing so, you can share your writings or drawings with the person next to you. At this time, we'd like to introduce to you one of our teachers, Radhika Balakrishnan.
Thank you all for coming. This is a very, very exciting event for us. And I just wanted to take 2 minutes to give you a little bit of a history of this course. It started 2 years ago as an experiment of taking students to the UN and to the Commission on the Status of Women. And we did an intensive weekend training and took students for 2 weeks and thought that maybe that was not the best model. And then the next year we actually extended it, and we were able to do a 1-credit course, and actually with the suggestion of Dean Swenson, who's here, said this should be a course. And so now it's a 3-credit course, and this is the first group of students who are actually doing it for credit. And I want to take very little time because I think this is their platform, and they've set up an incredible set of things that they're going to do today. So I'm handing it back over to you. Oh wait, sorry. I was going to do that at the end, but I know people are leaving in the beginning. But so this is a course in Women's and Gender Studies. It has been a collaboration between different departments on campus. So it was the Douglas Residential College and the Institute for Women's Leadership. Many of the students come from both of those places, so it was a collaboration. And also the undergraduate, the Office of Undergraduate Studies helped us in terms of finances to provide money to get the students to New York, to attend the Commission on the Status of Women and many other things, and Douglas Residential College paid for the lovely reception. So it's also a new model, I think, in terms of classes, is that it's a collaboration between different places in the university, and a different kind of service learning model that I think would be interesting for us to think about.
At this time, we'd like to invite you all to please pass down your one post-it note to the middle of the aisles, and we will collect them and actually post them up during our program. And right now, Bethany and Marinette will explain to us a little bit about our experiences in the class.
So my name is Bethany Sheenice. I am a senior here.
I'm Marinette Awad. I'm also a senior.
We began our very first class with a question. What do you want to learn about? We said things like human rights, trafficking, women's health, development, conflict, among many other things. We ended up learning about not just these things, but so many more. This class incorporated readings and visits from feminist leaders who taught us about the history of the women's movement, how activists are appealing that women's rights are human rights, and even how we can use platforms like Twitter and Facebook to influence opinions and start changing the world. we were all given the opportunity to go to the Commission on the Status of Women at the United Nations and learn about this particular function of the UN. The Commission on the Status of Women, or the CSW, is held at the UN, and its intention is to create a document that helps solve the priority theme for a given year, which in 2013 was violence against women and girls. We were shocked to learn, however, that only member states get to negotiate. No NGOs, non-governmental organizations, or advocates are allowed to speak during the negotiations, and the panels that the NGOs hold are outside, for the most part, of the United Nations. For the majority of us, this was where our experience at the CSW took place. We saw incredible men and women talk about their solutions for violence against women, development issues, health problems, human rights violations, among other topics. There were women from all over the world attending, and we all learned important and lasting lessons. After the Commission on the Status of Women, we began thinking about what was needed to make real changes on this issue, and what we would do to be a part of it. What we came up with was the concept of feminist leadership transforming boundaries.
So through our experience at the Commission on the Status of Women, the CSW, we saw and met many feminist activists that took a stand within their own communities. These women and men fought for women's rights in all aspects. They were the ones who went to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or better known as CEDAW. They produced shadow reports, which are now called civil society reports, to challenge the government's reports on what is actually occurring in the country. By doing this, they challenged the government in a global setting where the government will be held accountable. They went to the environmental conference in Rio in 1992 to speak up about the intersections between environmental rights and women's rights. In Copenhagen in 1995 at the Conference of Social Development, they gave a feminist perspective on economic issues, which was previously overlooked. And they were the ones that organized the largest conference on women, connecting 50,000 women's groups from all over the world in Beijing. And they are the leaders for women's justice in their hometowns, standing up for the voiceless women in their societies. These women took the boundaries of their culture, religion, and gender and recreated them. They refused to be shackled by these boundaries, so they stood up for their human rights in an active, effective way. We learned lessons from them about perseverance, critical thinking, empowerment, recognition, listening, and so much more. These lessons are critical for success. Furthermore, we saw these leaders came from every kind of community, class, religion, ethnicity, and background. These differences did not create boundaries, but rather a variety of viewpoints and ideas being brought together to represent everyone's views and needs. At the CSW, we realized that we are the next generation. These women have and are still working hard for equality, and now it is our turn to join them in transforming these boundaries that are still holding us back. It is our turn to become the next feminist leaders.
So part of that feminist leadership that going forward we want to embody and start changing and making is making it not about broadcasting our views, but making a conversation. So I had talked briefly about Twitter, and I don't know if you see up here, we have a hashtag. So during this event and afterwards, it's tech, it's beautiful. We would love for you to tweet things that you're learning, think about in the future going forward. If a Steubenville incident happens again and someone says something, what do you think that effect of transforming feminist leadership, or what transformations should happen so that things like this don't continue to happen? We want this event to be interactive and participatory, because if it's one person speaking, like I am right now, it doesn't do much. It's about everyone coming together and everyone being at the table, which is something that we want to embody in this event. Thank you.
Supposed to go. Oh, and so am I. Hey, Catherine. Who holds the cup? Am I supposed to go up next? And hold up the signs, right?
All right, welcome everyone. personal testimony of survivors of violence in the United States. Rubab, Ira, Amma, and Audrey will be presenting us with stories of different women's experience from all forms of violence against women. After our experiences at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women and the Women in the World Summit, our class felt that the U.S. was often left out of discussions, instead exoticizing and tokenizing experiences of women in the Global South. When I say the Global South, I'm referring to what was previously called the Third World. For this panel, we want to focus on violence against women within U.S. borders to draw away from the idea of American exceptionalism. U.S. accounts of women are often left from the table. So the purpose of this panel is to create a space where these voices can be heard. First is Rubab, who will be presenting for our story, a woman who was incarcerated and experienced violations against her reproductive rights.
Reproductive rights are violated daily within the United States. This violation occurs most directly affects marginalized communities whose stories are often silenced. I'll specifically be talking about incarcerated women and health violations that occur during pregnancy. And I'm going to be leading Jennifer for our story. In November 2008, I was arrested for cashing fake payroll checks. I was charged with forgery and booked into the Cook County Jail, a sprawling complex on the southwest side of Chicago and one of the largest jails in the country. I was almost 7 months pregnant at the time. One day, the following January, I went to court for a hearing, and there the pains began. An ambulance was called, and the officers cuffed my hands and chained my legs together. Another chain was placed around my belly, connecting my hands to my feet. When I got to the hospital, the belly chain was removed, but my legs were still chained, and one hand was cuffed to the bed. The doctor and the nurse were telling the officer, "Is this necessary? Where is she going to go? She's in labor." I remained that way for 8 to 9 hours, until it came time to push. At that time, the correctional officer unlocked the leg restraints and left one arm cuffed to the bed. An hour later, I delivered my baby girl. Here I am, a mother giving birth. It should be a happy time in my life. I know that I did something wrong, and you have to take responsibility for what you do, but it wasn't like I was a murderer.
Thank you, Rubab. Next, we have Ira, who will be presenting Yvette's story, who experienced domestic violence at the hands of her ex-husband.
While survivors of domestic violence are predominantly women, DV not only devastates females, but also men, families, and communities at large. In 2001, the New Jersey Police Crime Reporting Unit released a study that said an act of DV occurs every 6 minutes and 23 seconds in New Jersey. I will be illustrating a story shared by Yvette, a survivor of DV. I narrowly escaped death at the hands of my ex-husband. In the early morning of October 10th, 2005, he called me 14 times, leaving me a message about how he wanted to have sex with me, and he said on the phone how he wanted to fry me like Crisco grease. So I called the police. The police came but simply took a report. I thought it was kind of odd that they weren't going to issue a warrant for his arrest, because I do have a restraining order filed against him. Later that morning, I started my shift at T-Mobile. He showed up carrying a soda bottle full of liquid. He turned to me and said, "I love you," and began pouring this bottle over my head. He then chased me out of T-Mobile and lit a match. I felt the flame whoosh over my body. It felt so hot. I felt the flesh dripping from my skin. I suffered severe burns, 60% of my body, and severe scarring on my face. 3 weeks before my attack, little to my knowledge, the judge had lifted my protective order requiring my husband to stay away from me without notifying me. The judge retired shortly after. He filed a 14-page letter saying it was a clerical error. Clearly that was not the case. My ex-husband is serving a sentence, but is serving a life sentence, but is eligible for parole in 15 years.
Thank you, Ira. Now we have Amma, who will be presenting us with Debbie's story of being trafficked in the United States.
Human trafficking is estimated to be the second largest international crime industry. It is believed to generate profits of an estimated $32 billion annually. And in the United States of America, the U.S. is principally a transit and destination country for trafficking in persons, and it is estimated that 14,000 to 17,000 people, primarily women and children, are trafficked to the U.S. annually. When I was 12 years old, I got into a fight with my mother and ran away from home. I ended up staying with a friend's older brother at his house and intended to go home the next day. But when I tried to leave, he told me that he was a pimp and that I was now his property. He locked me in a room, beat me daily, and advertised me for sex on websites. Once, I looked out a window and saw my mother on the street crying and posting flyers with my photo. When I tried to shout my mother's name from the window, my pimp grabbed me by the hair and yanked me, threatening, "If you shout, I will kill you." I eventually escaped my confinement and am now at a treatment center for girls who have been sexually trafficked in New York.
Thank you, Amma. Our final testimony is presented by Audrey, who will be sharing Nancy's story, a young woman who was gang raped at a U.S. university.
Sexual assault is forcing a person without their consent to participate in a sexual act. This can be rape, sodomy, child molestation, incest, and attempted rape. In the U.S. alone, every 2 minutes, someone is sexually assaulted. Just imagine how much higher the statistic would be if it included every country. This is a survivor's story. After a night of being intoxicated at a party, I remember waking up confused with a guy on top of me and another lying next to me. They took turns raping me as they laid there in shock about what was happening. After they both passed out, I left and made it back to my dorm. I called my mother and described how ashamed and guilty I felt sleeping with 2 guys in one night, to which my mother responded, "That was rape." I decided not to report the incident because the 2 men were football players whose parents were donors to the school, and I felt no one would believe me. However, the trauma I felt from the gang rape was extreme. I suffered post-traumatic stress disorder for 8 months, and I did not want to return to Occidental College for a second year, and I constantly feared running into my attackers. 2 weeks after my assaulants graduated, someone told me the 2 had admitted to gang raping to all of their friends. I was able to move forward and heal due to the help of different organizations like Project SAVE, Survivors Circle, and HEMONS.
Thank you, Audrey. One factor that contributes to violence against women is the influence of the media. Media perpetuates societal norms that allow these egregious treatment of women. To exemplify this, we will present a commercial by the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, also known as PETA, which aired across U.S. airways. This commercial received intense backlash from women and human rights groups across the globe. While watching this video, we would like you to think critically and identify what you find wrong with it.
This is Jessica. She suffers from BWV-AKT boom. Boyfriend went vegan and knocked the bottom out of me. A painful condition that occurs when boyfriends go vegan and can suddenly bring it like a tantric porn star. For Jessica, it's too late.
Are you back? You feeling better?
Please go to bwvaktboom.com and learn to go vegan safely.
Okay. This class, well, everybody can think about what they found wrong with the video. I can see your reactions that it found a lot of things wrong. All right, so overall, this class helped us understand how to use a feminist lens in our daily lives. Feminism is the practice of thinking critically and deconstructing societal norms that perpetuate violence against women. This video normalizes gender stereotypes and negative forms of masculinity. It also displays a detrimental portrayal of a romantic relationship. Our decision to incorporate this video was to highlight the importance of using communication technologies as a feminist strategy for developing critical perspectives. We must actively question the media and integrate feminism into our daily conversations. Thank you.
As Bethany and Marinette described, we learned about many various topics in women's rights and policymaking in the United Nations, including violence against women and girls. And as you heard here, we also realized that there are unheard voices that are not at the table. But this inconsistency in whose voices are and are not heard can also be manifested in the global forum.
Okay, my name is Zena and I'm a senior here.
Hi, I'm Alma and I'm a junior here.
I'm Dina and I'm also a junior. And we created this video that we're about to show you in response to the Women in the World Summit that we went to. And the summit is presented by Newsweek. It was created in order to bring the human rights abuses committed against women and girls globally to the forefront and illuminate activism that surrounds it. Going to the summit, we had a lot of critiques, and this experience taught us a lot about transforming feminism and the ways to reach across borders and about feminist leadership. So I shall play the video and I'll show you what we have come up with.
When attending a summit titled Women in the World, what do you expect to see? Call me crazy, but I expect to see a room buzzing with women from all different intersections of race, class, cultural backgrounds. Even more, I was under the impression that I was attending a feminist world leaders conference filled with diverse voices and cross-boundary participation. But, oh, I was strongly mistaken. So the thing is, if we want to fully empower and better the situation of women all over the world, we cannot only allow one fraction of the population of women to represent the entire population of women. And so as the event unfolded, so did the ironies. The fact that the Coca-Cola company both sponsored and hosted a panel was beyond me. The company is responsible for water shortages, contamination of groundwater and soil, and exposing populations to toxic waste in areas known as the Third World. Where's my red flag, people? In my opinion, the conference should have realized the implications of hosting a company whose capitalist nature boasts millions in gains on the losses of others.
Yes, there are women in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East who die from childbirth due to lack of health care. And yes, a young woman's rape in India was horrendous. And yes, hundreds of women are trafficked from Latin America. And of course, let's not forget the atrocities of war that are facing the women of Syria at the moment. But in the U.S., thousands of women die due to lack of healthcare access every year. And hundreds of our own daughters in the U.S. are trafficked and pimped out for the sadistic needs of others. And rape in the U.S. is a constant occurrence. And on a daily basis, women are in constant threat of gun violence. Women in the world, your title says the world. The U.S. is not an exception from any negative issue that plague other countries. The U.S. has the same issues. Inequality is global.
We recognize the politics and the reason for why the summit is structured the way it is, looking at corporate funders and the ones hosting the events. Nevertheless, they should be held accountable. In order to change women of the world for the better and to hold them accountable to their name, women of the world, we challenge the summit to be more inclusive. So I want you, the viewers of the video, to tweet women in the world with our hashtag #TransformFem and challenge them to be more inclusive and to have a global panel, not just focusing on women from the global south, but on the west as well. After all, inequality is global, and the only way to ameliorate this inequality is from solidarity with women working in the movement. We challenge them to transform boundaries, not as markers of difference, but as agents for change.
So these observations that we found at this conference about the divide between, or the divide in the discourse about so-called women's rights between the global north and the global south, led us to begin to critique feminist discourse itself.
So I firmly believe that the way you say something is very important. You can have all of the great intentions, but if you say something that is harmful, you are harming someone in the world. So what we're going to do right now is an exercise in speech. So what we're going to do, we have red flags, and you have red flags, correct? So take them out. One of the qualities we think is key for feminist leadership that can transform all these boundaries we've been talking about is critical thinking, really analyzing what people are saying. So what we're going to do, we all have some quotes that we're going to read. Some are very problematic, others are good. So we are going to say a quote, and if something raises a red flag for you, you think something is problematic, we want you to raise your red flag. Then we're going to ask you why you think that. If you think something's fine, that's okay too. We'll ask you why, and we're going to talk about it. All right?
So to begin with our first quote, nothing important can come from the global south. The axis of history starts in Moscow, goes to Bonn, crosses over to Washington, and then goes to Tokyo. What happens in the south is of no importance. And some folks are very clear. Okay, so I noticed you guys raised your flag. Would anyone like to volunteer their critiques of why? What they saw as problematic? If anyone would like to, you can raise your flag. Can you? Okay.
By saying that they have no contribution, it's almost like eliminating their meaning, their purpose, that their culture has no value in the world when it does contribute to the global world.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And that's exactly why this quote is so problematic. Ultimately, it's dismissive, and it kind of narrows the scope of history by focusing on Western history and the successes of Western culture without recognizing global South contributions in terms of resource, culture, and political thought. So now we'll be moving on to our next quote.
Okay. So this one was actually said in commercials leading up to the Women in the World Summit by Diane von Furstenberg. Every one of them said, "I will not be a victim." The Afghan girl, she said, I was lucky to go to school. I'm going to make sure other girls in Afghanistan can go to school. The Indian girl, who was incredible, she was a victim of gang raping. Her family sent her away. She said, I am not going to be a victim. Natalia, she's a beautiful model. You could look at her and she's just the most beautiful girl in the world. She worked in the market. She grew up selling vegetables. She has already created 100 playgrounds in Russia. So what do you think? Any guesses? Okay, so if no one raised a red flag, why do you think it's okay? Or are you unsure? And if you're unsure, you can also raise a flag and say why. I'm not moving on until someone says something.
I saw a few red flags.
Go ahead.
I mean, I don't agree with it, but I can't put my hand on I'm not very comfortable with the language. And
okay, so what parts of the language don't you like?
I mean, who's the one who presented this commercial?
Diane von Furstenberg. She's a fashion designer.
Okay, yeah, I mean, she has no perspective or positionality to be able to speak about these women's stories.
Okay, very important. So coming from the West, what are your rights about speaking?
Like her attitude towards them, almost as if they have to fight for everything, that they don't even have a right to study, or they almost like she feels like she's superior to them.
Okay. Anything else?
I just the way how she was talking about them, that the Indian girl, she doesn't know who they are, what they
Yeah.
the kind of person they are.
Okay, so when I listened to this, there were a few things that stood out to me. So what you just said. So she says the Afghan girl, the Indian girl, and then names the model, who she calls beautiful, by a name. So very problematic.
I was just gonna add, because I was at the Women in the World as well, and when she was presenting, she presented, I think, 2 African women, and she would hypersexualize them, oh, she is so sexy, and this and that. So that was another issue I found.
So she's reducing them to their nation or some kind of physical characteristic, which is not good. The second thing we talked about is that they have to fight. This whole concept of every one of them said, "I will not be a victim," is as if saying that everyone else that is a victim just decided to be a victim, which is incredibly problematic. When you think about rape culture, essentially it's victim blaming. You're culture blaming, essentially. So by saying that these women, stood against all the other victims in their culture, overlooks so many other factors that contribute to a lot of the struggles of women globally.
It's the same type of language that's clothed in the title of feminism, so we have to be extra wary of it. So I'm going to move on to another quote. We all write in contexts, and when we come to write the history of the woman question in the Middle East, we found ourselves caught between the contemporary Egyptian or Iranian or Turkish context, where Islamists denounce things Western, a label they, like many nationalist men before them, attach to feminism, and a Euro-American context, where the presumption is that only Western women could really be feminist. How to get beyond this? Showing Euro-American colleagues that there were real feminists in the Middle East. Women who fought for women's social, economic, and political rights means having to dismiss other aspects of their projects, i.e. being uninterested in unveiling, asking for limited reforms in family law, arguing in terms of an Islamic moral framework, and accepting female difference and stressing women's maternal roles for the good of the nation. These are strategic or expedient. So, what do you guys think of that quote? And that was by Leila Abulugad, who's a feminist in the Middle East. Good, good. Yeah, so that was one of the good ones. It was kind of long. It was really good, but it was kind of long, so I didn't want to lose track of it. But basically, the importance of that quote is she really highlights the importance of contextualization. She doesn't talk about the Middle East like the Middle East is so often talked about in a broad regional term. She talks specifically about Egypt, Iran, Turkey. She talks specifically about these different countries and with specifics in mind. So that was one of the things I wanted to highlight to you guys, is when you hear things about the Middle East, when you hear things about Africa, you have to question, what exactly are you talking about? What social class are you talking about? What economic class are you talking about? What ethnicity, what religion, all of these things matter very much.
All right, so the next one. Women are battered every day and almost every minute. In some parts of Africa, a woman is raped every 10 minutes. Yet this does not raise nearly as much furor as when a man is battered. The feeble response from the police when a woman reports violence, especially domestic violence, is that it is a domestic issue and it should be solved amicably at a family level. The woman is sent right back into the arms of her batterer and is not protected. This in itself is another form of violence against women. Women are indeed the first to feel the blow and the last to be relieved of it. So this was a commenter on the Arms Trade Treaty in 2012. So what do you think? Okay.
Can you repeat the first part again?
Yeah. Women are battered every day and almost every minute. In some parts of Africa, a woman is raped every 10 minutes, yet this does not raise as much furor as when a man is battered. The feeble response from police when a woman reports violence, especially domestic violence, that is a domestic issue and it should be solved amicably at a family level. Okay.
So why the focus on Africa specifically when domestic violence seems to be a global issue?
Okay, very good. Anything else?
It was
a woman.
A woman.
This is a woman.
She mentions two different countries in almost the same context, as if, right? She
just talks about Africa.
Oh, okay. I thought I heard it.
Yeah. So, this is actually positive, and I didn't give you all the information because I felt it would give it away. She is an African woman. She was on one of my favorite panels at the CSW. And I think what really makes it good is the fact is that there is domestic violence and you do need to talk about it. But she doesn't talk about it in a way, like the quote I read before, whereas she is responsible for the domestic violence. She talks about how, how the structure in her culture is set up is that the police will send it back, which still happens here. And that talks about how women feel violence first and last, the continuation of it. And she is speaking from her own cultural perspective, rather than as a Westerner speaking on it in a way that looks down upon certain cultural norms and things.
She's also, just to add to that, challenging and questioning a framework. So instead of victim blaming and focusing on the individual, she's assessing and realizing that there's a larger
there's an institution, which is really, really important. So when that whole everyone else is a victim and it's their fault that they're a victim makes it this it's the individual's problem, whereas an important critical thinking ability is to see the structures that create these impositions of violence and things.
All right, so moving on. This is a short quote. It's time to cheer on girls and women who want to sit at the table. And this was said by Sheryl Sandberg in her book, Lean In. Do you want me to repeat it? Yeah. It's time to cheer on girls and women who want to sit at the table.
kind of an assumption that not everybody wants to sit at the table, that only,
Yeah.
only a few do.
We should break down your thing.
Yeah.
Well, that was exactly my critique of it, is that this is speaking to a very specific kind of 1% feminism. And this table that she's referring to is really referring to a corporate America that's built on the labor of oftentimes exploited and undocumented workers, women of color, the developing world, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, we do need to cheer on women and girls, but we also need to question this so-called table that they want to sit at, and make sure that we are not empowering a certain select number of women and girls above others. So it's a little confusing quote, because it again, it is language that is empowering, but then you have to question who it's empowering and why it's not empowering everybody.
A lot of the things that we've started thinking about is like things at surface level seem great, but are actually not once you look at it more. Like the things that can be shared on your Facebook wall or tweeted are sometimes very on the surface. And you
So
really
this
have
is
to-
a great quote,
Yeah.
right? Like this is a great quote that you want to put up on your Facebook status and you want to like pass around
Yeah,
to people and
ladies.
post stuff, put in post-its and post stuff everywhere. But you have to again question who's saying it. Does she have money?
Yeah.
What color is she? Like things matter. These things matter.
Can I push back? Because I think Sheryl Sandberg has gotten a bad rap, which is to say I have a critique of capitalism, but I also know that there's a real gender inequity in who runs corporations, right? So if you think that women's leadership has the potential to transform corporations, and you think about what the environments of those places are like in terms of lack of mentoring, right, then creating a culture whereby women do feel invited to the table and able to sit and participate is in fact very important. And so some of the pushback of the critiques of Sheryl Sandberg have said very clearly that folks rushed to totally disqualify her because she is a rich white woman. So it became, you have nothing to say. Your critique is automatically implicated. And even though I am a black feminist and an intersectional feminist, I think that's unfair, right? And I think that we have to think about what feminism looks like in various modes of institutions, right? And so if you're talking about transforming institutions, then having more women at the table potentially is a good thing, right? And so I just think it's complicated. It's not that I agree with her on all points, but I don't think that she is easily dismissed simply because she has money, for instance.
No, I agree. And I think it's also important to look at this quote and make sure it doesn't become a stand-in for feminism itself, which I've done a lot of articles where she's starting to bring in the new wave of feminism. So we have to be careful about how much, yes, we do have to give her credit within the context that she's speaking in, but we also have to be careful that that context is understood and acknowledged by everybody versus just like popped up and then hiding the actual like significant institutional imbalances.
And something, when we were planning this, we used the word problematic very intentionally. We do not want to say the word wrong, because if we're talking about not dismissing people, you cannot dismiss people. It's entirely hypocritical. But it is important, I think, that we do look at the feminist leaders that we have right now and see if they are bringing everyone to the table. And I think that's one of the things that we felt like. And like some of the other things that we talked about, like leaning in, like why don't we talk about how impoverished women, like universal childcare, like why aren't we leaning in about that? Why aren't we making corporations focus on issues that hit women in low-income areas? Even though the top is important, but we think it has to be more holistic, which was our problem with
Which ultimately is what the quote is about, like the class differences and the experiences of women in feminism, and how feminism can be implemented in a way that kind of stays inclusive and stays aware of these differences and the variety of experiences that women have. Women of color, women of different variety of gender identities, and so forth. Like it's important to be inclusive of that. And this is also why we use that term problematic, is because we want to make sure we're staying inclusive of that conversation. Because how can we try to implement our own very specific view of feminism if we're, continuing to exclude other groups of people that have always been a part of that narrative. So if we can actually transition into our last quote. So we must ensure that the global market is embedded in broadly shared values and practices that reflect global social needs, and that all the world's people share the benefits of globalization. So is this problematic or is it not, and why? If anyone's interested in contributing?
Who said that's
I'm sorry? You said it. Oh, Kofi Annan?
Kofi Annan.
I'm sorry. The Ghanaian diplomat.
Yes.
Sure. We must ensure that the global market is embedded in broadly shared values and practices that reflect global social needs, and that all the world's people share the benefits of globalization. So, do you think this is problematic or not, or maybe so?
It's kind of saying that globalization is beneficial.
Yeah.
When most of its effects have been negative to the global south in general.
Anyone else?
Well, doesn't the quote push back against that though by saying, I think it's a critique of that, right? Which is to say that globalization can't, that it isn't, that it, Kofi Annan was one of the most progressive, Secretary Generals that you had at the UN. So that makes me think that in fact he's trying to push back against the inequities inherent and asking us to think about what happens if everyone is at the table transforming the conversation, right? Yeah.
Which is ultimately the focus, actually, is that the idea is like kind of making globalization have an egalitarian fix. So, the idea of sharing, looking at and accepting these broadly shared values, how they can be implemented to include people of different classes. Addressing community needs that reflect the global social needs. So ultimately, this was actually supposed to be an optimistic, very supportive quote that's inclusive. So, this is it, actually. We've finished with our quote. I hope that this has helped you. And we'll be transitioning to another activity. Thank you.
So at this time, somebody replied. We'd just like to ask you all to take a moment to reflect on what you've learned from this program. Given what you've heard and what you've seen, we wanted to ask you guys what feminist leadership now means to you. So using your the post-its, the second post-it that you've been given, as well as your markers, please do depict that using a word or a picture, and we'll be collecting those.